Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my MSI 2025 Finals overview and analysis video. It's the final video of MSI. Really appreciate it if you've been watching the content all tournament long. It really does mean a lot to me. You guys have been super engaged in the comments section with those likes, and honestly, it really does mean a lot to me. This has been a very fun tournament to cover. A lot of people have already talked about it online, but this is one of the better LoL esports tournaments in recent memory. It really has been a blast, and hopefully that carries through into the finals. So I just wanted to say thank you, but you know, all of the posturing is done. We're done with the setup. We're done with all of the, well, if they win this, then they'll feel better going into the next one. It's win or go home. It's win or lose. That's it. There's nothing left. It's the finals. The winner becomes champions. The loser becomes runner-up. So this is a big deal, the biggest series of the year so far in LoL esports, and I'm excited to cover it. If you're excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. What did you expect from this series? Did it live up to your expectations, or were you surprised by the outcome? Of course, I'm excited to kind of go over what my expectations were going into this series and talk about whether or not, you know, things went the way I anticipated. But this has been a very fun tournament no matter what ends up happening here, so I am pumped. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go game by game in the finals, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a finals MVP, an MSI finals MVP, to the player that I think embodied their team's success the most on the day. Nothing to preview, nothing to talk about. We will just be concluding MSI at the end of the tournament. So, without further ado, let's head into our discussion, kind of talk about where I think these teams are coming from going into this series. Of course, it's a rematch of winners finals. It's a rematch of a matchup we've seen hundreds of times in the LCK at this point. It's the number 1 seed from the LCK in Gen.G, taking on the number 2 seed from the LCK in T1. Arguably the two most successful organizations in League of Legends over the past 5 or 6 years. I think that is a very fair thing to say. Gen.G has been able to dominate the domestic league in Korea, the LCK, for many years now. They are multiple-time champions. They are coming off of an undefeated split so far in the spring split. They have yet to lose a best-of series so far in spring, which is utterly ridiculous, but it's T1 on the other side of this argument. Not only are they the most historic organization in League of Legends history, but they have upheld that reputation so far in the 2020s. It really felt like they were, I don't want to say on the fall off in terms of how things ended in the late 2010s, but after 2017, they didn't make another World Finals until 2022, which I know doesn't feel like a very long time because most teams only make one World Finals ever, but this was a team that was continuously in World Finals in 2013, 2015, 2016, 2017. Like, every year it felt like SKT was dominating the league, and so from 2018 to 2021, for them not to make any sort of finals appearance, for them to miss Worlds a couple of times in that stretch of time, it certainly felt like T1 wasn't quite the juggernauts that they had been previously, but they remake World Finals in 2022, and even if they're not able to, you know, come up with the big one against DRX in a pretty big upset, they go on to win in 2023, they go on to win in 2024, and here they are in the finals of MSI once again in 2025. They have reasserted themselves as the best and brightest organization in the world, the one that is always the team to beat. No matter what has happened throughout the year, no matter how they got to any particular tournament, they are always going to be the team to beat at that particular tournament, and MSI has certainly been no exception to that. I know a lot of people, even after, like, Gen.G's undefeated split and the way they looked against a really good team in Anyone's Legend in round number 2, I know a lot of people who went into the winners finals just saying T1 plot armor too strong, and T1's just going to be able to figure things out. Now, Gen.G was able to get the job done in that series with a 3-2 win, but it certainly was not clean. That was a very, very back and forth series. Through the first 3 games, it looked like Gen.G was just going to outclass T1, especially from game 3, where they were able to slow the pace of the game down and really take over from a macro sense, never really give T1 an avenue to breathe their way back into the game. They just kind of had to sit there and watch themselves bleed out. But game 4, Gen.G gets a lead. They're not able to hold on. T1 ends up winning the game. Game 5 is the opposite. T1 gets a gigantic lead through Owner's Lee Sin at the beginning of game 5, but they're not able to hold on. Ruler's Jinx ends up getting 2-fed, and they come back and win the game and, you know, go to winners finals. T1, to their credit, rebounded incredibly well, going down to the lower bracket against Anyone's Legend, and wow, that series was also incredibly close, and T1 once again went down 2-1 in that series. It was actually Gumiyushi's jinx this time in game number 5 that really elevated them. Keria was awesome. Owner was incredible in that series against anyone's legend, which is huge because obviously Tarzan's in incredible form right now. And if all of those things can carry through to the finals, it's crazy, but I think more people are expecting T1 to win this still. They've yet to be able to beat Gen.G, not only this split, but their record against Gen.G is not good. Even at international tournaments, really, it was just the semifinals of Worlds where, Gen.G wasn't able to overcome T1. I know they haven't played a lot of best of series, but the best of one that they played at Worlds 2 years ago was Gen.G favored. And obviously, every time this team plays domestically, it really is Gen.G favored. And so it's crazy to me that T1 is, kind of heavy favorites coming into the series, but I can't say I don't understand it. Like, Meteos said on the desk, the plot armor is just so strong for T1. It's really hard to bet against them in an international final, especially for a team like Gen.G that maybe hasn't had the international success that you would expect. But if you're going to look at matchups and why this is such an interesting series, obviously, it's Chovy versus Faker in an international final. Everybody's going to talk about that. The narrative. It's the GOAT of League of Legends versus the best player in the world right now in Chovy. That's always going to be very fun internationally. And I know some people are going to take umbrage with the statement that I call Chovy the best player in the world. Come on, man. Like, let's be real. Let's live in reality for 2 seconds. But that's kind of the fun little interesting tidbit that goes with this. You have players like Ruler that have had a ton of success and also a ton of failure against T1 in their history on both Gen.G and on JD Gaming. You have players like Canyon that obviously are considered some of the most relevant in the world, but you have someone like Doran on T1 who's looking for his first international title because he's the newcomer to this T1 roster. There are so many interesting storylines, even T1 overcoming their own drama that they had at the beginning of this split with Gumiyushi in the bot lane, really solidifying on the roster and still making an international final in the spring split. There are so many narratives going into this. I didn't even mention Duro. Duro's a rookie. This guy, not really a rookie. Technically, he did play like 8 games last year for Fear X, but this is a guy who was brought in as like the pet project for Gen.G, and he's already become one of the best supports in the world. He is now in the top 10 list for players for shortest amount of time between joining a tier 1 organization, playing your first tier 1 game, and making an international final, which is ridiculous. Like, the amount of storylines going into this are plentiful, but you probably already know all of those. This matchup has been talked about to death, not only because it's already happened here at this tournament, and I've already previewed it, and we've covered 5 games between these two teams, but because it's happened domestically as well. It's really just about who steps up today. Somehow, some way, T1 are walking into this as favorites, but my projection was Gen.G 3-2. This series always goes to 5. These two teams almost never end up going less than 5 games, and, I can't really say that I'm sitting here expecting it to go any other way. I think I would be more surprised if it went less than 5 than if it went 5 games, because that's just how it goes between Gen.G and T1, but my prediction was still in favor of Gen.G. I'm not going to bet against them until they give me a reason, and right now, they are the best team in the world. If T1's plot armor comes in thick and strong, then I am going to, say, yep, they got it. Like, it's all them. I'm not going to sit here and lambast T1, but until they prove that they can beat Gen.G, I have to give faith to the team that's been able to pull it out all year long up until this point. We'll see if that ends up being correct because, to go game by game means we get to cover everything, and that means starting with game number 1. Let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was T1. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0, and this is a huge game 1 win. You guys know I think game 1's super important in terms of setting the tempo for the entirety of the series. I know that's not necessarily been the case so far at MSI in particular, where game 1's kind of been cursed a little bit throughout a lot of these series, but that's kind of been broken, I would say, the more we go along, the further we get into this MSI tournament, but this is a huge win for T1 in game 1. A couple of big picks taken off the board in this first game that aren't going to be picked, obviously, with Fearless for the rest of the series. Things like Talia for Chovy is gigantic. Jax for Keen, I think getting that off the board is gigantic. And even on the other side, obviously, Faker's Orianna, Keria Alistair. These are some of the biggest picks for these particular players. And, they're certainly not pulling out all the stops in game 1. You've got to hold some cards closer to your chest for a longer series, but this was not a game that either of these teams wanted to lose. And T1 being able to pick up the victory is pretty massive for them. If you are new here, what we're going to do is talk about draft and then jump into how I think that draft actually affected the gameplay. So let's get into that draft conversation. I think this is a pretty easy conversation for me to have because I think T1's draft is way easier to execute on. I completely disagree with the broadcast and the commentators in terms of how this, how this draft ended up going down. I think T1 has so many more outs in the later part of the game. Gen.G has to do so much more in the early part in order to actually function. And really, at the end of the day, as much as I love, Chovy and Canyon and think that they can really do a lot of damage in this series because they're very good players and they've played well against T1 in the past, this is Ruler's game to win or lose on the Lucian. It's really entirely up to him. Talia's not going to have any sort of pressure in this game. The B1 Talia is always something I recommend going for because I think that champ is just so strong. It's really difficult to ever pass that up unless something like Pantheon or Varus is available. But, this is not a game where Talia's going to have the most priority in the world. Orianna actually should do a relatively good job of shoving in the Talia throughout a majority of the mid game, not allowing her to move around the map. And Sejuani's certainly not going to have any sort of tempo into the Jarvan. And so it's going to be difficult for, the mid-jungle duo to actually express some of the positives that they drafted for, and that means that Lucian has to just dominate the bot lane. And if that happens, I do think that there is an easy way to win this game, which is playing through, maybe not side lanes, but like playing through Jackson, Talia, creating these big macro problems, and Lucian being able to win a lot of these fights. The problem is, again, that takes such heavy execution. I get that you have a lot of frontline, and so if you do get gold onto things like Sejuani and Braum, and you have backline access as well with things like Jax, you can theoretically win the front-to-back, but it's so much easier for T1 to play a front-to-back around Jarvan, Orianna, even like a Jhin with Alistar and Gwen, than it is for Gen.G to try to play around a Lucian as their primary carry, which is likely going to have to be the option in the later part of this game because, you would think maybe Keen would be able to do it. We'll talk about why that just didn't happen. He got a big gold lead. He just didn't really do anything with it. It's really up to Ruler, and it's just not a comp that I personally would have gone for. In a game 1 draft, I do think you were kind of pigeonholing yourself into getting this gold lead early, and it really didn't end up landing, but that's my personal draft preference. I prefer at least having some sort of late game out on your team to be able to give yourself a reason to say that we can scale into the late game, and that just wasn't the case. But let's talk about the execution. This was a Faker Orianna game. He's going to get player of the game for game number 1. You wanted to talk about like narratives coming into this series, and the big narrative is like Faker's the most clutch player of all time. That's not debatable. There's, so many instances of him rising above his own level of play throughout the entire year at major international tournaments, especially in big moments like World Semifinals, World Finals, MSI Finals, to be able to really carry games. We've seen it over and over and over again from somebody like Faker, and Chovy has kind of, whether rightfully or not, been given the narrative that he is a choker. I have the shout out the Chokv guy in my comment section. I really appreciate him because he boosts engagement on my videos by like 100x. Like, he just keeps commenting over and over again, and it really helps get my video into the algorithm. So I honestly really appreciate him. Shout out that guy. But the Chokv, narrative that I think had been going around for a long time. Chovy's never made a World Finals. Chovy's never really been able to elevate his team to being the best in the world at these international tournaments. If you just ignore MSI last year, that narrative kind of makes sense. But, Faker, Faker needs to be able to step up in that kind of way in order for T1 to feel like they have that plot armor. At least in game 1, he was able to do that. And we'll get to Chovy. He was awesome on Gen.G side. This was a great game from him. He was one of the better players in the game. Made it so hard for T1 to actually fight for a majority of this. It's just he was the only one on the team that could do anything throughout a majority of game number 1. But Faker was more relevant. Those shockwaves were good, but it's really his positioning that made it unreal. In that final base push, he didn't even use shockwave. He was playing melee range, but the threat of Faker shockwave was so gigantic that Gen.G just played so careful and had to be so calculated. Faker having the wherewithal to be able to hold on to that summoner or that ultimate to really threatened Gen.G over and over again was super impressive. So Faker with just one of those Orianna games, he's had so many of these, not only over his career, but even at this tournament. This has been his best champion so far at MSI, and that has been abundantly clear. Another great game from Faker. I think you can point out a couple of other players. I think Keria had a really great game on the Alistar. He almost always does on this champion. This was his game 5, like dominating pick versus anyone's legend in the semifinals as well, where he was just able to completely run the map. This is still the best support in the game from my perspective. I think you can make an argument that there are other options, but what Alistar does, I think, is so difficult to deal with, and I think he's great against a lot of the popular picks in the meta. I like Lucian Braum. I think it's Lucian's best lane, and again, this is kind of a tough lane for Gumayusi and Keria to play out from a 2v2 perspective if Gen.G put resources into making sure the Lucian is okay, but that just didn't end up happening. Keria got to run the mid game, and he's awesome in terms of like finding engage angles and really setting things up. Guma goes deathless, always a big positive. Again, being the better AD carry in game 1 was huge in terms of the outcome, and then Owner and Doran were also fine. Owner certainly had some nice engages, had some bad ones as well. I'm certainly not going to just sit here and praise him for every single play he made, but the big ones were very good. Doran was less relevant in this game than maybe the rest of his team, but, you know, that's fine. That's how top lane goes sometimes. So credit to T1, especially Faker. Great game in game one. And then for Gen.G on the other side, we can talk about the positives first. Solo laners got some pretty big leads early on, which isn't exactly what you would expect in some of these matchups. Chovy was in a really great spot for the majority of this game, and honestly, this was a 34-minute game. This is a 25-minute game if Chovy doesn't exist, or if it's a regular player playing Taliyah. Chovy's Taliyah is just unbelievably broken. That's why I'm so okay with him picking it on B1. Basically, no matter what ends up happening, he delayed this game by himself by like an extra 10 minutes. It just was the way that it was. It was so difficult to end up pushing into Chovy because he was constantly landing these fantastic shoves back or, you know, forward or whatever, wherever he needed to land anything. Like, he just had a great end game. It's just the rest of his team wasn't in a spot to ever be able to follow up. Keen got a big gold lead in the early game and then played almost every single fight about as poorly as you possibly can. He's getting dead of the game for me in game number one. Really frustrating performance. Keen has to be better than this. He's been really good at this tournament, and so I'm willing to, you know, say, well, it's just game one on Jax, you know, put that aside and we can figure things out, but it certainly wasn't the game one that maybe he was looking for. I really hate the Sejuani on B4. I think that's one of the bigger problems with Gen.G's draft. I think you just need more things to do in the early game, and I get that things like Xin Zhao and Wukong and Vi and Pantheon were all taken off the board, and that's a lot of the actual proactive junglers in the game that can go out and try and make plays, but even then, like, there's got to be some other option than Sejuani into Gwen, which I just don't think is ever really going to feel good in the back half of the game, and you really do lack, like, front-to-back damage to play around the Sejuani as we go further and further along. It really is up to the Lucian, and while Ruler was okay, he wasn't great. Duro also didn't have that great of a game on the Braum, although how much of that is his fault and how much of that is that he's playing Braum and his team is at a goal deficit for a majority of the game. You know, it's kind of understandable that he's maybe not the most useful player in the entire world. He did step up a little bit too much. But overall, this was Chovy attempting to pull back a game that was pretty much lost, that everybody else just kind of ran down. And it looked like T1 was just better in game number one. So credit to T1. That's a huge game one victory. If they're able to go up 2-0 in this series, you're starting to talk about, well, you know, Gen.G's, you know, the monkey on the back never really jumped off after the winners finals victory. After Gen.G finally took down T1, it's still there if T1 can still take them down in the finals. But Gen.G need to equalize. Can they do that here? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece. And did we really expect anything else? This is just how it goes between these two teams. It's always a back and forth. Nobody is ever able to take a gigantic lead over the other. It's what makes these matchups so fun every single time these two teams play off against each other. But this was Gen.G's game from start to finish. They dominated this one, even more so than I think the stats on the screen would indicate. It kind of looks like it was close, like there were moments where T1 had things going for them. I don't know if that was ever really the case. There were a couple of missteps. I think Keen made a pretty big mistake by not stepping into a Ryze ultimate in a top lane fight around Otacon that let Gumayushi get a couple of kills and, you know, shut down Chovy, shut down Ruler. You know, Keen was incredible outside of that in this game, but it was a small mistake that ended up, you know, pushing some gold in favor of T1. But outside of that, this was Gen.G through and through, and it's a really great bounce back after game number 1. For T1, pretty tough here. Picked, again, a lot of the champions that they feel really comfortable on, specifically Galio and Poppy taken off the board for this team, I think is actually pretty massive. These are some picks they've relied on really late in a lot of these Fearless drafts, and it's just not worked out for them here in game number 2, which again is very big, although Gen.G obviously a lot of comfort on their side as well, so continuing to monitor that. But let's go ahead and get into draft because I actually have some things to talk about when it comes to this. I don't want to make any sort of inflammatory comments, and if you want to sit here and say that I'm being annoying or that, you know, obviously who am I to speak on, you know, draft and on all of this stuff? Obviously, you know, the who am I conversations, you kind of know who I am. I've been doing this for 4 years and I've, you know, consistently scored higher than most other analysts in terms of predictions and being able to accurately tell wins from draft and all of that stuff. But I understand if you want to sit here and be like, who am I? But all of these pros and former players and analysts on the desk talking about, oh, T1's dive comp with Camille Galio, it's so easy to perform with, and, you know, Wukong's there, like, obviously T1's going to win this, and, oh, it's T1 on a dive comp. Like, I don't understand what we're looking at here, man. This comp is impossible to dive. Like, there's no way that you were ever going to be able to get on Gen.G. There's so much healing and shielding and protection coming through. It's Sion, which obviously is already going to mega stop the Camille, which was really bad on R5 in the top lane. Like, Camille is useless this game. Obviously, true damage is great. Sion's gonna stack health throughout this game. Camille's gonna be unable to ever hit anyone on the backline of this fight because Sion's just gonna stand in her way of every single thing, and she's never going to be able to kill this Sion. Sion's a counter to Camille. Like, that is just generally how things go, at least from my perspective. That's always kind of been the case, and so I really don't understand that. I get it's Faker Galio. You're going to expect him to be able to dominate around the map. What play is Faker, like, jumping into here where he's actually going to be able to kill anyone? It's basically 4 bruisers and Senna. Like, how are you ever supposed to play Galio in this game? Like, all of those people that were sitting there, all due respect. Again, I'm really not trying to, like, shit talk any pros because I think they are smarter than me, but I was just so confused because these players that are smarter than me were sitting here looking at this draft and saying, well, T1's just going to be able to dive onto the Ryze and the Senna and win the game, and it's like, what? Like, are we looking at the same draft? Can we be having the same thoughts? Like, it's actually insane to me that anyone thought that. This is a hard game for T1 to play out. Gen.G's ease of execution is so much lower, I guess, in general. Like, the ease of Gen.G's comp is much easier because Senna obviously is going to infinitely stack. It's really hard to ever kill, like, Ryze or, you know, Vi in these situations where you want to try and dive, and Senna has so much peel throughout the rest of this team that it's basically impossible to get on Ruler as well, and he's only going to be getting more and more range, and so I don't know, man. This is a tough game for T1 to be able to win. I came out of draft feeling pretty good for Gen.G, a lot better than game number 1 for sure, and they definitely executed on it, but really at the end of the day, you know, Keen becoming the raid boss of the game is probably the biggest reason why. He's gonna get player of the game for me. You know, I debated this because Chovy was excellent in this game on the Ryze. He really is kind of going under the radar for just how good he was on the Ryze here, but Keen really was kind of the main character for Gen.G. He got a gigantic lead. A lot of attention was put towards the top side by Canyon early on in the game, and that did help Gen.G a lot to actually be able to push the tempo and, you know, create a lot of these mismatch situations. And once Sion got fed, this game's over. Like, it is impossible to play. Who is ever killing Sion on the other side? Corki can do it eventually, but Corki has no way to actually step up in these fights because he's constantly going to be under threat of Vi engage. And if Vi just full sends it onto the Corki, this game is over. Like, there's no way to play it out. Obviously, you have Peel and you can kill the Vi from that point, but then you can't kill the Sion from that point moving forward. And you're having to break through Vi in the backline with Senna ultimate coming through, with Nautilus also diving in. Like, this is a tough game to play for T1 the moment that Sion gets any sort of gold. And so, you know, credit to Keen. He was much better in game 2 than he was in game 1, even if he did make probably the most egregious mistake of anybody on Gen.G, which was not stepping into that Ryze ultimate. It looked like Chovy was completely inting on that play, but if Keen just goes with him, like, they just ace the entire team and he just wasn't on the edge of the realm war. But just, it is what it is. Chovy's one death wasn't even really his fault. So this was an unreal good game from Chovy. He's been excellent across the first 2 games so far. Again, I know that the narrative is Chokv and all of this stuff that I've always pushed back against and I always thought was ridiculous to begin with. I've been very vocal about that. I've received a lot of criticism for that on this channel, but, like, this guy does show up in big moments. It's just sometimes he's not allowed to be the guy to really kind of carry games. It's not always the situation that Gen.G finds themselves in. He's carrying right now. Through the first 2 games, he's been the best player on the team. This was an incredible Ryze game. He made a couple of big plays, specifically that catch onto Keria, I believe around 20 minutes, that really just ended the game. Like, instantly, it was really, really big, and obviously his positioning is just ridiculously good. Ruler was like 8,000 stacks ahead of schedule in this one. I've never seen a Senna get souls so quickly. In terms of the setups, it's actually just incredible how well Ruler's able to play it. You know, very Masu-esque, jokes aside, but, like, Ruler's the best Senna in the world. We've known that for a long time. Duro and Canyon were also really good, but this was a Keen Chovy Ruler game. And then for T1 on the other side, like, as much as I'd like to sit here and lambast Doran, this is a hard game for the Camille to play. I'm gonna lambast the draft. I'm gonna criticize the Camille. We'll just say that. Like, the R5 Camille doesn't really make any sense to me. It makes sense in terms of the composition and, like, you're playing around Galio diving in and Wukong diving in and Poppy, like, being really aggressive, and you have Camille to kind of facilitate that dive potential. But the problem is, again, like, who are you diving? Are you diving Ryze? Are you diving Senna? Like, Senna's just going to go invisible and the entire team is immediately going to start peeling, and then if you dive anyone else, you're not going to kill them because they're tanky enough. Like, Ryze is basically a bruiser, and everybody else here actually is either a bruiser or a tank, and you've got Senna healing going on top of them, and so it's just basically impossible for Camille to play this game. She's never going to break through the stacking health bar of Sion throughout the late game because true damage, you know, that's the counter to true damage, is just raw health, and that's what Sion is. And so, I don't know, man. Doran was useless. He was getting picked off before fights. He just had a horrible game, and the champion itself was not not very good. He made a couple of plays that I think were generally fine, but, you know, his champion was useless, and so he's dead of the game. It's just kind of how it goes. Everybody else on the team was fine. I think Guma had a couple of great fights, but also was way too far forward for most of the early game, was actually regularly getting punished. That's what kept Gen.G in the early game, even when T1 was making some positive plays. Faker never really found an engage angle. Not entirely his fault. He just couldn't really do anything. He built full damage. He could never break through anybody on the enemy team. Owner was kind of useless. Keria was kind of useless. He missed a couple of key ultimates as well. Keria did. That did kind of impact some team fights, but for the most part, this was, again, a Gen.G game where they just played the map really well. Keen got super strong, Chovy got super strong, Ruler got super strong, and that's GG's. So credit to Gen.G for hanging in there and tying up the series at 2 apiece, but now we're heading into Game 3. You guys know I believe Game 3 to be the most important in the series. If you can win this, you set yourself up perfectly to be able to close out the series. So who's going to get that 2-1 series lead? Well, the winner of Game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go back up in this series 2-1, which is kind of a new situation for them. They're super used to being down 1-2 in these series. And so, you know, now they're finally on the upper hand from a game 3 victory. And it makes things a lot more interesting because this was a very dominant game from T1. They end up really snowballing things out of control very quickly for themselves once they get their lead. A fantastic fight, I believe, around Grubs. I don't believe it was Herald. I think it was Grubs. That ended up really turning the game around and not, I guess not turning the game around, but really solidifying the game in T1's favor because this team already is in a spot where they scale incredibly hard. I mean, you're looking at a Zir Xayah as your damage. In the back end of this game, you've got an Ornn for frontline. Nocturne's going to be full disruption. Renata is great peel and great engage, depending on how you want to play her. I'll get to the Renata. I think that's the one piece I'm not as sold on, and Keria just played like an absolute maniac. Like, this champ looked incredibly broken, but, you know, again, we'll talk about it. For Gen.G on the other side, though, I don't hate their draft. I just think it's worse, right? Like, I just think it's harder for them to be able to win the game. I don't think you're looking at a ton of pressure in the early game, and I think you're looking at getting outscaled. I think it's difficult for Xin Zhao to ever feel relevant in terms of his performance in this, and I think we kind of saw that. Gen.G ends up playing one fight really well, and it just doesn't matter. Like, the Grebs fight that I was just talking about, they play it totally fine. A great engage from Duro, great follow-up from Keen. It doesn't matter. They just don't have the ability to actually win it. They played it about as well as they could, and they just couldn't ever actually play the game. So I think this game was, I don't want to say over in draft, but this was definitely a T1 draft advantage, and I think we'll talk about why as we go forward. In fact, we'll talk about it now because it's the draft segment that starts this off. I think you're looking at a scaling advantage for T1, and I think most of these lanes are looking at, you know, lane advantage for T1 as well. I think specifically, you know, I like the Ornn into Rumble matchup. I've talked about this a lot at this tournament. Rumble's going to be able to generate a gold lead in the early game, but it's going to be kind of an artificial gold lead for the most part, because not only will Ornn equalize it out with his items in the later part of the game, but also Ornn is more valuable in the later part of the game. He's one of the few champions that's just inherently better than Rumble as the game continues to go along, because as much as the equalizer is a fantastic teamfight ultimate, and there's a reason that Rumble's been prioritized so heavily at a tournament like this, there's also something to be said about the fact that, like, it's just damage and it's a small cone. Like, the knock-up coming in from Ornn, like the CC chain from the ultimate that can be layered on top of things like a Zir ult or Renata ultimate, it's just so much more valuable inherently than Equalizer is in the later part of the game that, you know, I just like the matchup for Ornn into Rumble. I think that is a very good answer. I'm also not a huge fan of Annie into Azir. I think this is one of those matchups that's just kind of, okay, well, you're kind of letting Azir scale into the late game because it's really hard to pressure advantages as the Annie. Chovy did great this game to try and, like, do something, but it's really tough to do anything on Annie in this game when your team is already losing. I also don't really love the idea of taking the player who's been the best player on the Rift in the first 2 games. The Taliyah was trying his best to really stall out game number 1, and he was awesome on the rise in game number 2, and just putting him on something like Annie that doesn't really have agency of its own, it feels like a very weird draft decision, and I get that Annie's been very successful. It pairs very well with things like Xin Zhao, and you can play for this Rumble Sivir win condition later on, but I don't know, man. Like, Chovy's been awesome through the first 2 games. Like, let him play something where he can be awesome in this series. That would be my personal advice, but it just kind of is what it is. So generally, I like T1's draft a little bit more. Nocturne should actually have a free level 6 here. Like, there's no way to really be able to punish T1 early from my perspective, unless Xayah just gets super greedy, but it was the opposite. In this game, they end up catching out Duro and getting a 2v2 kill in the bot lane, and that really kind of starts the conversation about who carried this game, which was the 2v2 bot lane for T1. That Gumayushi and Keria, this was their game number 3. They were the main characters in terms of how things ended up playing out, and that's awesome to see if you are a T1 fan, because Ruler was such a big deal in the previous series. Duro, I think, has kind of gotten the better of Keria throughout their matchups this year if you look at their domestic matchups. So for Guma and Keria to be able to step up in Game 3 and really perform well on a pick that, the one pick for T1 that I, maybe would have criticized a bit more in the Renata, like, that's huge. But it's hard to criticize Keria. Even if I don't like the pick in isolation, Keria dominated on it, and so it's really difficult for me to be like, oh yeah, you shouldn't have picked Renata when Keria is clearly so comfortable. He's player of the game. 5-man Renata ultimate at Grubs, that just completely ends the game, like, instantaneously. It's almost impossible for Gen.G to be able to play that one back. It wasn't even their fault. Like I said, Gen.G played that fight about as well as anyone can, but you had a 5-man Renata ultimate and things are going to get pretty difficult at that point. So, credit to Keria. His ultimates throughout the entire game were great. His handshakes throughout the entire game were great. He looked so comfortable. I know the conversation is like Renata being held back by Callista. Renata's hard to play in this comp, I think, at least in terms of actual execution difficulty. I think Annie in particular makes Renata a bit less good, all things considered, with just how easy it is to blow her up in a lot of team fights, but Keria outplayed Gen.G, and that's why he ended up walking out as the player of the game. Guma also had a terrific game on the Xayah, though. This was definitely a Gumayushi game in terms of the damage that was being output. He stepped up at a couple of games in this tournament. He's also had a couple of bad games at this tournament. I'm not going to pretend he's been perfect, but, his good games have been some of the best in the entire world. It's great to see that he's back in form. Faker was super stable on the Azir. Wasn't really the main character, but was very good. Owner had a couple of plays that were actually criminal. The fact that he traded 1-for-1 around, I believe, that second dragon fight, one of the dragon fights, where he ends up just going in, getting full comboed by Duro, and the entirety of Gen.G is on him, and somehow he trades 1-for-1 is actually just absurd. It goes to show that Nocturne actually is a good champion when he's not being played by European players. All due disrespect, but Doran also totally fine on Ornn. Just a general good game for T1, but this was really a bot lane performance for them. And then for Gen.G on the other side, I mean, they just got blasted so early on in the game. They had no way to recover. This Sivir has not looked good at MSI. I'm not saying that it's a bait pick, because I do think there are universes where Sivir looks okay, and the fact that things like Kai'Sa were taken off the board, the fact that this is a very bad Jinx angle to end up playing, the fact that T1 ends up taking Xayah in terms of their B4. I think a lot of those things are pretty negative for Gen.G in terms of finding an AD carry that actually can fit in this comp, because you need a scaler. Like, you need some way to be able to play team fights in the late game, but Sivir's just a little bit weak right now in comparison to a lot of the other quote-unquote hyper carries, and I think we saw that. First off, Duro makes a gigantic mistake in the 2v2 lane, ends up using his dash a little bit too early, gets hand shook back right into the middle of Xayah and Renata, and ends up dying for first blood. That's pretty bad to give over. He finds a fantastic engage, like I said, around Grubs, but it does not matter. T1 just play the fight better, and they end up winning it, and after that, Duro can't really find anything. He's done of the game, but it's not even entirely his fault. It's just one of those circumstances where, like, the Rel just kept going in and dying because there was nothing else to find in the game. If you wanted to give it to Ruler because the Sivir was useless, I think that's fair. If you wanted to give it to Canyon because Xin Zhao did literally nothing throughout this game, I also think that that's fair. It should probably go to one of those three. Chovy tried his best to pull some things back. He was pretty much useless throughout this game, but when you're watching his positioning, it was really good. His stuns were pretty solid. He just was doing no damage because he's Annie in the mid lane. You put your best player on Annie in game 3. Very, very weird decision. And then you've got Keen on the top side, who was landing 5-man equalizers. It's just like, at that point, what else are you even supposed to do? Like, as Rumble, he was doing everything he was supposed to do. He just wasn't winning because he's playing into Ornn, and the enemy team was already up so much in gold. So T1 just kind of snowballing their way to a victory here and to a 2-1 series lead. They're one game away from taking MSI, from taking down Gen.G, and showing that, this international buff that they get, it's not just some sort of gimmick. It is who they are to their core, the clutchest team in the world. But Gen.G, they have to be able to stay alive. Are they going to be able to push us to a game 5, or is T1 going to close this out in a 3-1 series win just like they did in the semifinals of Worlds? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to push us to yet another Silver Scrapes game number 5, and they're going to do it in fashion that is unexpected, just completely outplaying T1. Like, this really was just one of those games where it's like, T1 has good setups, they have good preparation, they're in positions where they can play. They made a couple of small mistakes, but Gen.G just played fights better, and that means that they're going to be able to come across with a game 4 win. Very fun draft here from both of these teams. teams. It's clear that Fearless is impacting just exactly what they want to bring into Game 5 because you have things like Zeri and Jinx being taken off the board now because of the successes that they've had. Victor gets left through draft just in case that, Gen.G end up going to a game, or T1, I should say, end up going to a game number 5. They want to make sure that that pick is not available for Chovy in that game. I think that's got to be the thought process because I'll explain, just how dominant Victor has been for these two players in particular throughout 2025. But this is just a very, very fun game 4, everything you could have asked for, and Gen.G pushing us to a game 5. Super excited for it. So we can get into draft. I think this is probably the most balanced draft of the series up until this point. I could really see this going in either direction depending on who gets fed. I will say I think Jinx is in a better spot to carry late game than Zeri is because I think it's easier for Jinx to generate her lead in this game, but I also think that Hui is going to have a really hard time playing the late game here because of the Victor, and so it's really up to you who you think is going to have a better time. I think T1 has an easier way to win the game, but Gen.G have more forms of engage and more ways to actually just play front to back and play around the Zeri, so again, really up to you, however you want to call out what is easier here. I would have slightly favored T1, but I think it is kind of interpretation who you favor in draft. Again, I think this is either a Jinx game or it's a Victor game from my perspective. Zeri can still win this. I just think it's harder for her to take over. That being said, Ruler had an incredible game, and the Zeri absolutely ended up taking over, so I'm not going to criticize Gen.G for that, but that was mostly execution rather than draft diff from my perspective. Happy to see our first Zeri at the tournament, though. I think this champion has been criminally underplayed throughout all of 2025 because people are annoyed and kind of bored with her in general, just in terms of how things are, but she's still incredibly strong. We've seen it with Jinx at this tournament. Hyper carries can still just be free outs in the back half of the game. Hell, even Senna has kind of been a big problem for teams to be able to deal with so far at MSI. There is nobody in the world who plays Zeri quite like the LCK AD carries. It's just a bit of a player diff in terms of how much they've played that champion, and Ruler being able to pull it out and dominate on it and here in game number 4 is expected, but player of the game kind of has to go to Chovy once again. This guy's just the best player on the Rift right now through the first 4 games. You can talk about game 3 and how the Annie didn't really get to do anything, and I agree with you. You can even talk about game 1, and maybe I'm overhyping the Taliyah game. Up to you. Really, it's up to you to determine whether or not I'm right or wrong on that, but in terms of the 2 wins that each team has gotten, Chovy has been a super integral piece in both of his team's wins, and I think he's been the most consistent player throughout this series so far, and that's huge through the first 4 games. If Chovy's going to show up and really dominate, that's big for Gen.G. That's what's been happening domestically to allow them to consistently be able to beat T1, and it's happening right now. Now, I want to make this, I want to kind of tell a story for people who don't watch the LCK, maybe aren't quite as familiar with domestic play. Faker gets a lot of talk about his Victor and about how, it must be banned against T1. It's unplayable, and Faker's Victor was incredible across this year. I believe he's still undefeated on it so far in 2025. The only player in the world who rivaled his Victor gameplay was Chovy, because you had to ban Victor against Chovy, and I get that it's more famous that Faker plays Victor, but Chovy's was arguably just as, if not even more deadly across the LCK spring split. They banned this champion every game against Gen.G, and I guess T1 just felt confident enough to let it through. I don't really understand that. Chovy is the best Victor in the world right now, and for him to be able to get this in game 4 of a Fearless draft just feels absolutely ridiculous. And it was a great game from Chovy. His ability to just position perfectly, output optimal amounts of damage at any given point. I mean, he's optimized the ability to play League of Legends when he's playing from ahead, and that's exactly what he was doing here. Again, he's been the best player in this series so far. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate, but the rest of this team was great. The bot lane was excellent for Gen.G, especially after Guma and Keria had that big game 3. For Ruler and Duro to be able to bounce back and have such a big game number 4, gigantic. The Zeri was a big pick, and it really ended up working. The Zeri ended up taking over a lot of these late fights alongside the Victor damage. Obviously, those two together make it very difficult to end up playing out front-to-back team fights, but Duro, with some unreal engages on the Rakan, ends up absolutely styling on T1 at multiple points throughout this game. Really awesome stuff from him. Keen and Canyon were fine throughout a lot of this game. They weren't the main characters. This was Chovy, this was Ruler, this was Duro taking over for Gen.G. And for T1, it's the small mistakes that really end up coming back to bite them. This is one of their weaker games, I would say, at the tournament. Not that they haven't had bad games where they've been outplayed by AL or Gen.G or even CFO in round number 1, but I would say that this is definitely one of the ones where they made a lot of minor mistakes that they don't normally make, and they got punished for it. Specifically Doran, who just, didn't play well at all in game 4 here. He's going to get dead of the game once again here. In their 2 losses, he's just kind of not been good enough for T1 so far. We'll see how that ends up translating, but ends up missing a couple of auto attacks on a owner gank on the top side that ends up wasting a Skarner ult, and then ends up teleporting way too far away from the team fight, the pivotal team fight on the top side of the map that really ended up sealing the game for Gen.G, and it's just not really able to get involved, and that's even after Gen.G blows a lot of ultimates at the beginning of that fight. If Doran's in a better spot, maybe things can go a bit differently. I still think it's a very tough fight for T1 to take, but it's definitely possible that something goes in a different direction if Doran is just a bit more active. Faker was just way too far forward. I mean, constantly getting punished over and over again. This guy is leading the entire tournament in isolated deaths, and this game showed exactly why that is the case, because this dude just does not stop pushing. Like, I get that he's probably willing to trade his life for objectives and for pressure elsewhere on the map. Like, oh, if they're sending 2 or 3 to kill me, then, we can do other things. But when you're just in the mid lane laning against Ruler and Duro, and they just straight up kill you, like in the 2v1 because you're too far forward, like, that is a big problem. Faker seriously misplayed here in game 4. He's had many games like this throughout this year, and again, like, this is the Faker I've been talking about domestically, where he'll just randomly die at 15 minutes almost every single game. It's just crazy to see that that's translated to the international stage, where he usually cleans a lot of that up, but it's really not been the case at MSI this year. Reminds me a lot of MSI, 2 years ago, where he ended up being one of the weaker players at the tournament, something like that. Maybe it was last year. I'm trying to remember. I think, I just remember Faker having a bad MSI over the past couple of years. It's weird at this tournament. I do want to say Faker's been good at this tournament. I'm not trying to say that his tournament's been bad, just that the ways that he loses domestically are still the ways that he's losing internationally as well, which is definitely strange. Guma and Keria tried to take over, but Ruler and Duro were quite frankly just better in this game. Owner found some incredible ult angles. He was definitely the best player on T1 in this game. It's just like, Skarner can't 1v9. That's not the champion that can do that if you don't have damage to follow up on the impales. They don't exist. Like, it's just kind of the way it goes. So for T1, now you're going to a game 5, and you know what? This is your comfort zone. It's an international final, game 5. Like, this T1 has done this over and over and over again. Gen.G are the relative newcomers to this position. They're not usually at the top of the standings in these international tournaments outside of MSI last year, and so this is the chance for them to finally get that monkey off of their back, to finally overcome T1 in an international final. Their biggest rivals, Chovy versus Faker. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series 3-2, and your 2025 mid-season invitational champions for back-to-back years will be Gen.G, and they do it just by outplaying T1 once again. This isn't some sort of gigantic draft gap. Honestly, this is a super greedy game 5 draft from both of these teams, and yet here we are, Gen.G playing the fights just a little bit better, being able to output just a little bit more damage, and in fact, being able to control space all that much more efficiently means that they are the team that walks out with a victory. Do not feel bad for T1, though. This was a great performance from them all tournament long. This team played phenomenal. They did a lot of really great things throughout this entire tournament. They overperformed their domestic form by a lot. It's just that Gen.G showed up here today. This team, when they are playing their brand of League of Legends, is not beatable at the top level. I really believe that. Like, that's how good their best form can end up looking, and that's how good they looked here in game number 5. This team was not going to be denied their perfect split, which they get with a perfect 23-0 record to end off spring. Incredible stuff for Gen.G. And again, great stuff from T1. It just wasn't enough. They played well in this game, but they weren't able to come out on top, which we'll obviously talk about. But, let's start off with draft. Again, I think both of these drafts are relatively equal. I don't know if most people are going to see it that way, but it's legitimately just who gets the lead early, who wins the game. Like, it's either Aatrox, Nidalee, Misfortune that ends up being able to run the early game, or it's Renekton, Caitlyn, Karma that end up running the early game, and anything in between is just not going to work. Like, if you are down gold at 15 minutes, I think the game is just over. Like, I get that there's a Viego out in the late game for T1 and an Aurora out in the late game for Gen.G, but it's really freaking tough to play through those when Caitlyn and Renekton are diving onto you, or alternatively when Aatrox is basically unkillable and Pyke is pulling the Viego out of his reset. Like, it's really difficult to play this out if you are either team and you don't have a gold advantage, but that's why it's so important that Gen.G actually did win in the early game. They played a lot of these fights well. One of the things that Gen.G just does at a ridiculously world-class level, better than almost any team I've ever seen, is control space. Their ability to make it impossible for T1 to walk into these close quarters quarters fights, even with comp that, while it's good at controlling space, you don't have like a Maokai or something like that that just does it for free. You need to be able to actually execute on it. The way that Gen.G just makes T1 so scared to walk up, it's ridiculous. This is what they did domestically. It's so hard to play against Gen.G when you don't have any space to operate in, and that was the case here, but let's just go through it, man. Finals MVP and my player of the game once again for game number 5 is Chovy in the mid lane. And I get that this is not an unpopular take, that everyone can really look at this series and be like, yeah, Chovy was the best player on the Rift here today. He dominated this series against T1. And again, I don't want to make it seem like T1, let him dominate or anything. T1 played really well today, but Chovy stepped up. This is the best player in the world. This is the player we've been waiting to see on the international stage. This was his best series of MSI by a large margin. And I'm not going to say he put the team on his back, because that's disrespectful to Keen, who I thought had a great series, to Ruler, who I thought had a great series, all things considered, and a great game number 5. But Chovy was the guy for Gen.G here today. 100% KP in game number 5. Most damage in the game by over double second place on the Aurora. Just an unreal performance from him in game number 5. And he didn't even have to be the one to get all the kills to carry the game. He wasn't super accelerated or anything like that. He just was playing perfect on the win condition here in Aurora, and he did it. Like, you say what you want about Chovy. The Choke V narrative, it's dead. Like, I'm sorry. Like, oh, we didn't win Worlds. Okay, Uzi didn't win Worlds. He's in the Hall of Legends. Like, Chovy is the best player in the world right now, and I think this series, if any series ever, completely proves that. There is no debate anymore, at least until we get into a spot where he just completely shits the bed at Worlds, which he's never done, by the way. Semifinals is still really good. You know what I mean? Like, this guy is just proven over and over again that he has what it takes to play at the top end level, and for him to put, I don't want to say put the team on his back, because that feels disingenuous to how well the rest of Gen.G played, but for him to be the best player on the Rift, arguably in 4 of the 5 games of this series, and, for him to, walk out of that with an international final win over T1, all the narrative should be dead. Like, at this point, there's just nothing else left for me to say. Chovy is unreal, and this was a legacy series for him from my perspective. Same thing for Ruler, though, in the bot lane. What a tournament from Ruler. You could argue Ruler is tournament MVP, and I think that's totally fair. There are some other players that I think were spectacular. Tarzan is definitely in the conversation for that for me. Owner and Keria, I think, are definitely in the conversation for that for me as well, who were awesome at this tournament. But Ruler might just take the cake in terms of just how well he played in almost every game. People hate Misfortune. I've been a devout Misfortune defender over the course of this year. The champion has consistently been around 60% win rate throughout all of 2025, and she does look very useful at being able to just basically force a lot of these mid-game skirmishes and, again, control space. But the aggressiveness that Ruler played with in Game 5 was unmatched. I mean, his tournament was absolutely unreal. For him to go deathless with the way that he was positioning in this game, absolutely ridiculous. Keen with an unreal good game number 5. Like, the Aatrox looked unstoppable. That guy was picking up kill after kill after kill. Canyon won MSI on his signature Nidalee. Duro pulls out Pyke. The rookie pulls out Pyke in game 5 of MSI, and he ends up winning on it. I get that he missed every single ultimate this game, but he still freaking won on Pyke against Keria in game 5 of MSI. Like, it's absolutely ridiculous. Gen.G has earned this win. This was the international version of the domestic version we saw of Gen.G, which is the best case scenario, and this team is just incredibly fun to watch. And for T1, again, don't take anything negative away from this. This is the best that they've looked all year long by a large margin. It's just that Gen.G was a little bit better, which we knew going into the tournament, but T1 put up such a fight. Bringing Gen.G to 2 different game 5s, ridiculous. They took down anyone's legend at this tournament. Ridiculous. They stomped BLG. This was a great tournament for T1. It's just they couldn't quite get it done in game number 5 here. Whoever you want to give debt of the game to, I think there are 3 options. Doran, Gumayusi, and Keria just didn't quite have a great game 5 here. Doran really couldn't play the game. It's not entirely his fault. It's just really hard to play Renekton when you don't get that big lead in the early game, and I do think that Keen is in a good spot to be able to win this. I really think the bigger issue from a mental perspective is that Guma and Keria did have to win in the bot lane. You pick Caitlyn Karma, and this is Guma's Caitlyn. Like, this is his signature champion in terms of what he plays, and they just got out-pressured the entire game. They were basically useless in game number 5. Owner had a really good game on the Viego. Faker tried on the Ahri, just not really much to do, but again, I don't want the narrative to be, oh, T1, let the team down or whatever, because they were fine at this tournament. But Gen.G is just better. Chovy proving that he is the best player in the world right now. Also, if you're a T1 fan in my comments, I like you and I respect you. And if you've gotten this far, obviously, you're level-headed and you have a good, sense of things about you. I just want to say this. The T1 fans in the crowd at MSI that booed Chovy when he got MVP, get rid of him. Throw him straight out. Like, that's just garbage behavior. Absolute clowns. Like, all of them. Like, all due respect. Like, absolute clowns. Like, just nothing to say. Sore losers. There's nothing else. Like, T1 wins everything and you're gonna boo Chovy for finally overcoming his demons. Like, you just have to be, like, a loser for that. Like, I can't think anything else. Sorry if I'm disrespecting anyone, but they disrespected this entire situation. So, just wanted to kind of get that out there, but Gen.G earned this victory. They beat T1 not once but twice at MSI, and they did it both in Game 5. They stepped up when it mattered the most, and it was everybody on the team who made that happen. I'm proud of this org. I'm proud of this team. And now that they've gotten an undefeated spring split, I mean, the pressure's on for summer. They've qualified for Worlds so long as they make playoffs in the LCK, which is obviously, going to happen for Gen.G, so this team doesn't have to, really put the gas pedal on because they won MSI, but still, I have a lot of expectations now for what Gen.G can become, and hopefully they can keep this up the whole rest of the year. All right, but that is going to do it for my 2025 MSI Finals overview and analysis video, and that's going to do it for MSI here in 2025. What a great tournament, one of the greatest of all time. 9 different game number 5s throughout this tournament is absolutely ridiculous. It's a fan's paradise in terms of getting competitive series, back and forth gameplay. Not really a lot of upsets. I talked about this on Twitter, but predictions were actually scarily accurate for most outputs, including me, throughout this tournament. I only ended up getting BLG versus T1 wrong. Every other series I got right, but that seemed to kind of be more of the reality rather than me being like way above expectation or anything like that. It looks like most analysts ended up really only missing 1 or 2 series. The only people who were above that were European fans who just had more expectation out of Koi and out of G2. Unfortunately for them, we were all kind of living in reality. That's really kind of the conversation around MSI. Congratulations to Gen.G again with their win. They are qualified for the World Championships so long as they make playoffs. No matter what happens in those playoffs, that's almost certainly going to happen. I mean, Gen.G was going to make the World Championships almost no matter what. I don't think anybody's surprised about that outcome, but it's nice to see that locked in just in case, things were to go wrong. It gives them a bit more flexibility and freedom, but that's it for the tournament. The next thing that you're going to see on this channel is going to be previews for a lot of the major regions. I know the Esports World Cup is coming up. I'm not covering that. I didn't cover it last year. I don't want to cover it this year. I just have no interest in the tournament. It's a random tournament in the middle of the year, and I just have no desire to watch or cover it, and so maybe I'll get around to talking about it in some of the videos, but I just have no desire to cover it, so it will not be covered on this channel. I'm sure there are plenty of other channels that will be happy to cover the Esports World Cup, but we're going to come back for the domestic leagues. I believe the LPL starts up next week, like literally next Sunday or next Monday, like 7 days from now. Absolutely ridiculous that they're just thrust right into action. I'm sure the rest of the regions will be pretty close behind. So if you're interested in, seeing me go over the LTA, the LEC, the LCK, the LPL, and even the NACL Tier 2 in North America, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be around when those videos, go up on the channel and when we start going over all of those regions. But of course, also leave a like on this. This was a lot of work, this MSI. So many Game 5s, so many hours of footage to kind of go over. I watch most games, once or twice, depending on just how much I can fit into my schedule. I try to get through these games a couple of times so I can really analyze these team fights, and it's meant a lot that you guys seem to really enjoy the content. So if you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.